the gripping the cold metal door handle when I heard my son call the vote without looking at me. Still, I loosened my fingers slowly, letting the chill bite my skin, while the room pretended nothing had happened. As the handle cooled further, the hum of the boardroom lights grew louder, like the building itself was listening. While that cold seeped into my palm, I remembered how I'd designed every lock in this place to outlast applause. The same metal steadied me as I realized the betrayal wasn't the vote. It was his belief that silence meant surrender. That's when I decided to let the door close, because power doesn't shout. It waits until it turns the key. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The annual strategy meeting was underway, and the tension in the room was palpable. Executives and board members gathered around the long conference table, eyes flickering nervously between the father at the head of the table and the son sitting opposite him. Robert Hale, the founder and majority shareholder, was now the former CEO, the man who had built the company from the ground up. His son, Evan, had taken over as the acting CEO. The transition had been smooth in the eyes of the public, but inside the walls of the company it was far from seamless. Robert sat with quiet authority, his presence still commanding despite the shift in power. At 66, years of strategic decision-making had shaped him into a master of restraint. He'd spent decades steering this company, ensuring its survival through market crashes, fierce competition, and ever-changing demands. His strategy was one of calculated caution, and he had earned the respect of those around him. Evan, on the other hand, was younger, brimming with ambition and impatience. He wanted change. He wanted to redefine the company, make it modern, break it free from the old ways. He'd spent months preparing for this day, convinced that his vision would carry the company into a bold new future. Today he would present his plan, and Robert's proposal would be his first casualty. The meeting was in full swing. Robert had just presented his proposal, outlining the company's growth trajectory, grounded in tradition and stability. The plan was deliberate, strategic. He knew it would be met with resistance, but he hadn't expected the dismissal to come so swiftly. Evan leaned forward, eyes bright with certainty, and glanced around the room. "I appreciate the effort, Dad," he said, his tone polite but cutting. "But this approach, it feels outdated." His words hit the room like a slap, the silence afterward hanging heavy. Evan continued, undeterred. "We've moved on," he added, as if the matter was settled. "The company has outgrown this kind of thinking. We need something bold, disruptive, not this cautious approach." The words echoed through the room, leaving a cold, uncomfortable silence in their wake. The board members exchanged glances, unsure how to react. Robert's gaze remained steady, his expression unchanged. He didn't flinch, didn't bristle. There was no anger, no frustration, only clarity. A calm understanding settled over him. Linda Brooks, the chair of the board, observed the exchange closely. She knew Robert. She'd seen his quiet resolve before, but this time felt different. There was something deeper shifting beneath the surface. As Evan basked in the silence, thinking he had made his point, Linda sensed the power dynamic had already begun to change. Robert didn't respond immediately. He sat back, composed, as if weighing the weight of Evan's words in his mind. The room waited, anticipating a retort, a defense. But Robert simply nodded, his silence speaking louder than any words ever could. He wasn't reacting in anger. He wasn't trying to fight back. He was allowing the moment to pass, preserving his dignity in a way that would resonate far more than a heated argument. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Robert's restraint had subtly altered the power in the room. Evan had assumed control, but Robert's quiet confidence had locked it in place. Unseen, but undeniable. The board would feel it soon enough. As the meeting went on, Evan's confidence faltered ever so slightly. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed, though he couldn't pinpoint what. The balance of power had quietly shifted, but he wasn't aware enough yet to realize the gravity of it, and neither was anyone else. The meeting concluded with a ripple of quiet congratulations. Executives and board members filed out of the conference room, exchanging polite smiles and handshakes. They were already congratulating Evan on his success, praising his bold vision and confident leadership. To them, it was clear. The generational transition had been made. Robert Hale, the founder, had handed over the reins, and Evan was now the face of the company. Evan soaked in the praise, smiling warmly as he accepted their compliments. "Thank you," he said, his voice brimming with self-assurance. He was riding the high of the moment, feeling the power settle comfortably on his shoulders. His vision was finally taking shape. This was the future, his future, and no one could challenge him now. But Robert remained seated at the head of the table, watching silently as the room emptied. His face was unreadable, his posture calm and composed. The air felt thick with unspoken tension. He had listened to every word, watched every gesture, and yet he hadn't reacted. Not even when Evan's dismissal of his proposal had stung the room with its boldness. As the last of the executives filtered out, Evan exchanged a final glance with his father. "I'll see you around, Dad," he said, his tone casual, almost dismissive. Robert didn't respond. He simply watched as Evan turned and walked out, surrounded by the buzz of success. When the door closed, Robert sat still for a moment, absorbing the weight of the situation. It wasn't the first time his son had sought to assert dominance, but it felt different now. Robert had never been one to react emotionally, but there was something about Evan's certainty today, his belief that the company was no longer Robert's, that cut deeper than expected. Robert stood slowly, the room around him feeling both familiar and foreign. He didn't linger in the moment. He left the conference room and made his way down the long corridor to his office. The building, once a symbol of his tireless work, now felt colder, as though the very walls were pushing him out. But he wouldn't allow it. Not yet. Inside his office, Robert closed the door softly behind him. He walked to his desk, his fingers grazing the surface as he sat down. There, nestled in the drawer, were the founding documents of the company. Robert opened the drawer and pulled them out, his eyes scanning the familiar words. This was the heart of the company, the bedrock upon which everything was built. He had designed every clause, every structure, with purpose, each decision made with the long view in mind. He knew the others had underestimated him. They saw age, they saw quiet, and they assumed weakness. But they didn't understand the depth of the systems Robert had put in place, the voting rights, the control mechanisms buried deep in the fine print. Evan had rushed into his new role, assuming the power shift was complete. But Robert's grip on the company was still firm, and Evan's rush had overlooked crucial details. As Robert leaned back in his chair, a slow smile crept across his face. The reckoning was coming. It was already in motion, but it would play out in its own time. Evan's victory today was temporary. He just didn't know it yet. The pieces were already in place. Robert hadn't lost control. He had just been patient. Robert sat in his office, the room bathed in the soft glow of the desk lamp, his fingers resting on the founding documents of the company. The smell of old paper and leather filled the air as he flicked through the pages, his mind drifting back to the early days, when this company had been nothing more than an idea. He had started with nothing, driven by a singular vision and the kind of relentless determination that only comes from years of struggle. Every decision had been calculated, every agreement meticulously crafted. He remembered the countless hours spent with lawyers, pushing for clauses that seemed minor at the time, but were designed to ensure the company would always remain true to his vision. Robert had insisted on one thing above all: control. Even as the company grew, even as he began to hand over responsibilities, he had never relinquished the power he had built. It wasn't about ego. It was about the company's survival, its future. As time passed and Evan took on more responsibility, Robert had slowly stepped back, but his influence had never truly waned. The board had assumed that the younger generation would naturally take over, that Evan's rise to CEO was inevitable. But Evan had missed something crucial in his rush to seize control: the fine print. Robert's mind returned to the present, and he picked up the phone, dialing Marcus Reed. Marcus, the company's chief legal officer, had been with him from the beginning, trusted to safeguard the company's legal structure. "Marcus," Robert said, his voice calm but purposeful, "I need you to check the founding agreement. Has anything changed with the voting rights?" There was a pause on the line before Marcus replied. "No, Robert. The control is still yours. The clauses are intact." Robert allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He had anticipated this. Evan's rush had overlooked the most important detail: the structure Robert had put in place long ago. He hung up, feeling a sense of clarity. He could act now, take control, but he wouldn't rush. Timing would be his ally. Evan had moved too soon, but Robert wasn't going to make his move yet. Not out of anger, but when the time was right. And that time was coming soon. Robert walked down the quiet hall to the IT security floor, his mind focused. He'd built this company from the ground up, and now, in a moment of subtle power play, he needed to ensure that even in his absence, from the day-to-day, control was still his. He trusted Daniel Wu, the head of IT security, for more than just technical expertise. He trusted him with the keys to the company's very systems, the backbone of its operations. Daniel's office was tucked in a corner, away from the bustle of the main department. As Robert entered, Daniel glanced up, his expression unreadable but respectful. "Robert," he said, standing up from his desk, "what can I do for you?" "We need to talk about the badge system," Robert said, his tone low but commanding. He moved toward the desk where Daniel sat, his gaze already fixed on the digital dashboard that tracked employee access levels. Daniel turned the screen toward him, showing a list of names, access privileges, and clearance levels. Robert's eyes narrowed as he focused on the hierarchy displayed in front of him. He already knew how the system was structured, but now, with Evan's rise to power, it was time to confirm something important. "The CEO's access outstrips most," Robert said, his voice calm but sharp. "But not mine. Founder access is still separate." Daniel paused. He understood what Robert was asking now, the silent weight of it settling in the room. "That's right," he replied slowly. "Founder privileges were put in place as a fail-safe. In an emergency, your clearance is higher. Always." Robert nodded, taking in the quiet confirmation. "Good," he said. letting the words hang in the air for a moment. He wasn't here to make demands or issue orders. Not yet. He needed Daniel to understand. This system still answers to me. Not Evan, not anyone else. Daniel's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. The control Evan thought he'd assumed wasn't as complete as he believed. Robert's grip on the company, albeit quiet, was still firmly in place. "I'm not here to disrupt anything," Robert said, standing up to leave. "But I need you to hold off. Let things unfold on their own." As he walked out, the door clicked shut behind him, leaving Daniel alone with the weight of what he now understood. The game had only just begun. Evan felt invincible. The board had backed him. The restructuring papers were filed, and Robert's outdated proposal was a thing of the past. He sat back in his chair, a grin creeping across his face. The company was his now, and nothing could change that. He'd orchestrated everything, carefully, decisively. His email to the board was simple: restructure for the future. He clicked send, the final act in securing his dominance. But Robert had already anticipated this moment. His calm demeanor in the boardroom was nothing more than the beginning of a calculated plan. Alone in his office, Robert sat in front of his desk, revisiting the company's founding documents. The weight of the papers was familiar to him. His fingers traced the lines he had written decades ago, each clause designed to protect the company from unforeseen threats. Like his son's impatience, Evan had missed something Robert had anticipated long ago, a dormant clause that would freeze executive privileges during a governance review. It was hidden, buried deep within the fine print, and it was a fail-safe Robert had put in place to ensure that no one, no matter how ambitious, could seize control without the proper checks. It was the ultimate safeguard, and Evan never read it. Robert signed the document that activated the clause, the motion now set into effect. The board was legally bound to comply, and Evan's attempt to push forward with the restructuring was rendered null and void. No one would be able to finalize the changes without a thorough review. Evan, unaware of the shift taking place behind the scenes, leaned back in his chair, basking in his perceived victory. The congratulations from the board members flooded in. "Excited for the future, Evan," one wrote. He felt untouchable, but the clock was already ticking, and the foundation beneath him was beginning to shift. Robert had made his move. The restructuring was frozen, the board bound to a review they never saw coming. The battle had begun, but Evan had no idea how much he had already lost. Evan moved through the company like a man who owned it, because in his mind, he did. The halls were his domain now. He'd taken control, and every decision felt like a stamp of his authority. The reshuffles had already begun. Departments were changing, power was shifting, and Robert's allies were quietly sidelined. He was pushing for a new era, one that had no place for the old, slow, cautious ways of the past. Evan was confident, too confident. He called in the key executives one by one, outlining his plans without hesitation. Each meeting, each conversation was a step toward solidifying his vision. There was no room for questioning, no time for doubts. He was moving fast, too fast, but to him, speed was power. He couldn't afford to waste a second. At the same time, Linda Brooks, the board chair, watched from the edge of the room, an expression of quiet concern on her face. She'd seen enough corporate power struggles to recognize the signs of someone who was overreaching. Evan's pace, his disregard for careful consideration. It felt reckless. But she said nothing. She simply observed, waiting, like a spectator in a play she knew would end in disaster. "Evan," she spoke up, her voice calm but firm, "You're moving fast, perhaps too fast. We need time to make sure these changes are in the company's best interest. A hasty approach could backfire." Evan didn't hesitate. "Linda, we don't have time to waste. This company needs to evolve, and it needs to evolve now." His voice had a bite to it, dismissive of her caution. The company was his, and there was no room for second-guessing. Linda remained silent, but the unease in her eyes didn't go unnoticed. Robert, who had been quietly watching from afar, felt a certain satisfaction. Evan's arrogance was his greatest ally. It was exactly what Robert needed. The trap was set. Evan's confidence, his absolute belief in his own invincibility, was all it would take. The speed with which he moved would unravel him. Robert didn't need to act yet. He just needed to wait. Evan's fall would come, and it would come fast. But for now, he couldn't see it. The problem started small. Senior executives tried to access the company's historical contracts, only to be met with a file-locked error. At first, they thought it was a simple glitch, nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. But as the day wore on, more and more of them encountered the same issue. Critical documents, essential to their next steps, were locked behind a digital barrier. Evan was the first to notice. His meetings were stacking up, and the documents he needed were essential for the next round of restructuring. His frustration grew as he kept trying, and failing, to access the files. He was becoming impatient. This wasn't just a minor issue, it was a roadblock in his path. He immediately called IT, demanding an explanation. Daniel Wu, head of IT security, answered the phone with his usual calm. "Evan, it's a routine update. The system's being upgraded. Should be fixed soon." "A routine update?" Evan's voice grew sharper. "You've locked critical files. This needs to be resolved immediately." Daniel's tone remained neutral. "I understand, but it's standard procedure. I'll escalate it. Just give it some time." Evan clenched his jaw. "I don't have time. Get it fixed. Now." While Evan simmered with frustration, Robert watched from the background. He knew that frustration was a powerful thing in a leader. It made people slip, made them act rashly. He didn't need to intervene. He just needed to watch as the pressure built. As hours passed and the issue remained unresolved, the executives began to murmur. Linda Brooks, the board chair, called Robert. "What's going on? We're getting questions from everyone. Evan is upset." "It's nothing," Robert responded coolly. "A technical glitch. It'll pass." But Robert knew better. The pressure was mounting. Evan, once confident, was now visibly rattled, his impatience growing with each passing minute. As the files remained locked, the board began to question the delay. The frustration was palpable. Evan's control was slipping. The more he demanded answers, the more his authority appeared weakened. Robert didn't need to make a move. Evan was already unraveling. Marcus Reed sat at his desk, the stack of legal documents in front of him, each page representing a critical shift in the company's fate. His fingers ran over the surface of the papers as he made the final preparations. The clauses Robert had insisted on decades ago, the ones that had seemed so unnecessary at the time, were about to take effect. Supervoting shares, Robert's safeguard, his final authority in moments just like this. Evan's overreach had triggered them, unknowingly. Marcus had always respected Robert's foresight. He'd seen the company grow, watched as the rules of power shifted with the times. Robert had adapted, but he had also ensured that the fundamental control remained his, should the need arise. Today, that need had arrived. On the other side of the office, Robert sat quietly, watching the city below. His silence was deliberate, his mind clear. He didn't need to rush. He never did. He had already made his move, the legal framework was set, and now he simply had to wait for the board to catch up with the reality of what had transpired. Marcus picked up the phone and dialed Robert's number. "It's ready," Marcus said once Robert answered. "We can activate the vote whenever you're ready." Robert's voice came through the line, calm and unwavering. "Proceed. The board will need clarification on the legality, but make sure they understand. This vote is binding." Marcus sighed, knowing that Evan wouldn't take it well. "Evan won't be happy. This could get messy. The board will ask questions." Robert's response was measured. "Let them ask. The facts will speak for themselves." As the board members trickled into the conference room, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The tension that had been simmering for weeks was now thick, suffocating. Linda Brooks, the chair of the board, observed the unfolding scene with a sharp eye. She had been around long enough to know that something was about to change, permanently. Evan's earlier confidence had now given way to an unspoken anxiety. He hadn't anticipated Robert's quiet but deadly leverage. The meeting began, and Linda took the floor. "We've reviewed the restructuring proposal, but before we proceed, Robert, Marcus, there's something we need to clarify." She turned to Robert. "What exactly is the legal standing of this vote? Is it binding?" Marcus stood, clearing his throat before stepping forward with the documentation. According to the company's founding bylaws, Robert's super voting shares are activated in the case of internal disputes. Evan's restructuring efforts have triggered that clause. He let the words settle in the air. "This vote, therefore, is legally binding. The company is required to comply with Robert's decision on the matter." Evan's expression darkened. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. He had been too quick, too confident. His push for a swift restructuring had been reckless. His assumption that power had shifted completely to him was about to shatter. Linda turned her gaze to Evan, her voice calm but firm. "Robert holds the majority in this vote. Unless there's a substantial legal reason to override it, we move forward with Robert's decision." The room fell silent. Evan opened his mouth, but no words came out. His breath caught in his chest as the realization hit him like a tidal wave. There was no escape. He had overestimated his control, pushed too hard, too quickly. Linda's gaze never wavered as she spoke again, this time addressing the room. "The vote stands then." Evan sat back in his chair, visibly deflated. The room had tilted, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Robert's quiet, strategic maneuvering had outlasted his son's youthful overconfidence. The foundation that Evan had tried to build was crumbling, and there was no way to rebuild it in time. Robert didn't speak. His silence was enough. Evan couldn't keep it in any longer. The frustration had been building for days, and the more he thought about it, the more the pieces of his father's quiet game fell into place. The locked files, the sudden shift in the boardroom. Robert hadn't simply stepped aside. He had been waiting, silently pulling strings, ensuring that Evan's every move would lead to this moment of reckoning. Evan stormed into Robert's office, slamming the door behind him. Robert was sitting at his desk, seemingly unbothered, as though he knew this moment would come. His hands rested lightly on the desk, his gaze fixed somewhere distant, waiting. Evan stood still for a second, chest heaving with anger, before breaking the silence. "You've been sabotaging me," Evan spat, his voice sharp with a mix of betrayal and rage. "You've been working behind my back from the beginning. I've done everything to take control of this company, and you're still pulling the strings." Robert didn't react immediately. He simply lifted his eyes to meet Evan's, calm and unwavering. The silence between them was thick, but Robert didn't seem in a hurry to fill it. Finally, his voice broke through. "You assumed I stepped aside," he said, his tone almost clinical, measured. "You assumed this company was yours to take, but you never understood how it works, Evan. You didn't see the structure beneath it all, the foundation I built." Evan's chest tightened at the words, and for a brief moment he felt his anger falter. "What are you talking about? I've done everything. I'm the CEO. This is mine now." Robert's gaze never wavered. "The system still answers to me. It always will. Your rush to power, your confidence, it blinded you. You never understood the power behind the silence. You've made your assumptions, and now you'll face the consequences." The words hit Evan harder than he expected. He had rushed into everything, believing the company was his simply because he had the title. But Robert's calm, silent authority had always been the real power. Evan had been playing a game with rules he didn't even know existed. Robert stood slowly, his eyes steady. "The board meeting is scheduled. The truth will come out, one way or another." Evan felt his confidence crack. His father wasn't just a shadow of the past. He was a force in the present. The real battle had only just begun. Evan approached the security checkpoint leading to the executive floor, his badge in hand. He'd had a busy morning, meetings, decisions, calls, and was ready to dive into the next round of restructuring. As he swiped the badge, expecting the familiar green light, he was met with a cold, blinking red one. He tried again, swiping the card more forcefully this time, his impatience growing. The door didn't budge. Confused, Evan swiped once more. Still nothing. His brow furrowed. "Excuse me, sir," the young security officer said, looking up with an apologetic expression. "It seems your access isn't working. Let me try it again." Evan's frustration spiked. "What do you mean? I'm the CEO. This should work. I need to get to the executive floor." The officer nodded, but his fingers trembled slightly as he tried to process the issue on his terminal. The door remained locked. Evan's gaze flickered over to the elevator. He was losing precious time. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, but louder than he intended. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer said again, his voice shaky. "I don't know what's going on, but your badge, it's been deactivated. It's not working." Evan's heart skipped a beat. "Deactivated?" His voice hardened. "This is a joke, right? Get me to the executive floor, now." Before the officer could respond, Daniel Wu, head of IT security, appeared, his expression unreadable. "Evan, it seems there's been a security protocol issue. Your access has been suspended." Evan blinked, incredulous. "Suspended? What the hell do you mean? I'm the CEO. I don't need protocol. I need to get to my office." Daniel remained calm. "The system flagged your access as part of a routine security measure. Your privileges are under review." Evan's jaw clenched. He could feel the board members behind him, watching, whispering. Linda Brooks, the board chair, stood at the back, a faint, knowing look on her face. Evan turned, eyes narrowing, frustration boiling over. This couldn't be happening. Robert Hale's voice broke through the tension. "It's not a mistake, Evan." Evan spun around. His father, calm as ever, stood there, a quiet authority in his gaze. The truth hit Evan like a brick. The system was working exactly as it was meant to. Robert had orchestrated this, and for the first time, Evan realized he wasn't in control anymore. The door remained locked, and Evan didn't have the key. The boardroom felt colder than usual as the members settled in. Robert sat at the head of the table, calm as ever. Marcus stood beside him, holding a stack of legal documents. Evan, sitting across from them, felt the weight of the room press down on him. He had known this moment was coming, but nothing could prepare him for the cold reality. Marcus cleared his throat and began. We are here today to address the activation of the governance clause. This clause, as outlined in the company's founding agreement, grants the founder, Robert Hale, extraordinary authority in the case of internal disputes. Evan's pulse quickened. He tried to hold his composure, but the words hit him like a slap. The clause had been dormant for years. Robert had carefully preserved it, and now it was being used against him. Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. This clause temporarily suspends the executive powers of Evan Hale. This is not a termination. It is a pause, a review of the governance decisions in light of recent events. Evan couldn't contain his anger. He stood up, fists clenched. This is absurd. I'm the CEO. You can't just take my power like this. Robert remained calm, his gaze steady. Evan, this isn't personal. This is about the company's structure and what's best for it moving forward. Evan's mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had fought for control, fought for this position, and now it was being ripped away from him in a single sentence. Linda Brooks, the board chair, spoke up. Evan, we understand your frustration, but the legal standing is clear. The clause was put in place for situations like this. We are only following the rules. The room was silent as the weight of the decision sank in. Evan's chest tightened with a mix of anger and betrayal. He had underestimated his father. The system that Robert had built, that Robert controlled, was now in full motion. The vote is clear, Marcus said, looking around the room. We will move forward with the temporary suspension of Evan's powers. One by one, the board members raised their hands, their votes unanimous. Evan felt the sting of each hand that went up. His grip on control, once so firm, was slipping. As the vote was final, Robert's eyes met Evan's. For the first time, the reality was undeniable. The game had shifted. The boardroom was still, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. Robert sat at the head of the table, calm and composed, while Evan sat across from him, seething with frustration. The executives, who had been caught in the turmoil of the recent shifts, now sat in uneasy silence, unsure of what direction to follow. Robert, as always, was the steady hand guiding them through the chaos. I've spent years building this company, Robert began, his voice steady, the words measured. This company was never about individual power. It was about structure. Vision is important, yes, but vision without a foundation is reckless. Growth without memory is risk. Evan bristled at the words. Was his father implying that his ambition had been reckless? Robert wasn't just talking about company policy. He was talking about Evan himself. But Robert wasn't finished. He turned to face the board, addressing the room as a whole. I've seen many of you rise through the ranks, and you know this. Leadership is not about quick decisions or grand gestures. It's about continuity. It's about understanding what has come before, so you can lead with clarity, not haste. If you forget where you've been, you'll never understand where you're going. Evan's chest tightened. The anger he had been trying to suppress, threatening to boil over. His entire strategy, his rush to modernize, to reshape the company in his own image, had been based on the belief that he could outpace his father's influence. But Robert's words hit him with unexpected force. It wasn't the speed of change that mattered. It was the foundation that underpinned it all. Robert's voice softened, but the authority in it was undeniable. You cannot lead from a place of emotion or impatience. Power isn't something you grab. It's something you build step by step, slowly but surely, until the company itself becomes the guiding force. Control doesn't announce itself. It locks the door when it needs to. Evan felt the weight of Robert's words settle over him, the realization hitting hard. His impatience had clouded his judgment, and now his father was making it clear. Leadership wasn't just about vision. It was about balance. "I'm not taking the CEO title back," Robert continued, his gaze steady, "but I am reshaping the oversight. The company needs more than a title holder. It needs a steady hand." The silence in the room deepened. Robert wasn't reclaiming power. He was redefining it, and Evan was left to figure out where he fit within it. The boardroom was silent, the weight of Robert's decision settling over Evan like a thick fog. The offer had been made, advisory status. Not a punishment, Robert had said, but a limitation. Evan's chest tightened as the words sank in. His rise had been swift, fueled by ambition and a belief that he could take control of the company. But now he was being pushed aside, not fired, but reduced to the role of an observer. "You'll be given an advisory role," Robert repeated, his voice calm but firm. "Your insights are valuable, but the company needs more than ideas. It needs stability." Evan opened his mouth to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't being punished. Robert wasn't taking revenge. He was simply making it clear that authority was earned, not assumed. Evan's rashness, his push for quick change, had cost him. The company didn't need chaos. It needed someone who understood the weight of what had been built. The room was still. The board members were quiet, their expressions unreadable. Linda Brooks, who had once seemed to favor Evan's vision, now sat back, her gaze understanding. The shift in the room was palpable. Evan realized, perhaps for the first time, that his actions had led him to this moment. The public perception had already begun to shift. His ambition, while admirable, had overstepped its bounds. Robert's calm was a stark contrast to the anger that burned in Evan's chest. "Leadership," Robert continued, his tone unwavering, "is about stability. It's about knowing when to lead and when to step back. The company doesn't need a leader who creates chaos." Evan's hands clenched, the weight of his father's words sinking in. He wasn't being banished, but he wasn't in charge anymore. Robert hadn't taken the CEO title back. He had simply reset the company's direction, taking the reins in a way that Evan could no longer ignore. As the board filed out of the room, Robert absorbed the criticism without a flicker of emotion. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. He was simply asserting his quiet, unshakable control. Evan had overestimated his power, and now he would have to learn the cost of that mistake. Evan left the room, his thoughts spinning, the sting of Robert's quiet authority still fresh. The game had shifted, and Evan was no longer in control. Evan sat alone in the boardroom, the door closed behind him. The weight of the day's decisions lingered in the air like a thick fog. His father had stripped him of the CEO title, but it wasn't just the loss of power that stung. It was the realization that his ambition, his drive to prove himself, had led him to this point. Pushed aside, relegated to an advisory role. The anger in his chest had nowhere to go. The door opened quietly, and Linda Brooks entered, her expression unreadable. She closed it softly behind her and stood in the middle of the room, watching him. "Evan," she said, her voice steady, "we need to talk." He didn't look up immediately. His thoughts were still clouded with frustration. "About what?" he muttered, his words sharp. "About leadership," she replied, her tone calm but firm. "Leadership isn't entitlement. It's earned. You've been given a role, but you haven't learned the full weight of it. You've acted out of ambition, but not understanding. That's dangerous. Evan looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time. His jaw clenched. I've been running the company. I've made the calls. I pushed this company forward when it needed direction. Linda shook her head, her eyes steady. You were pushing yourself forward, not the company. Leadership isn't about what you want. It's about what's best for the company, and you've neglected that. The words hit harder than he expected. He had always believed in his vision, in the changes he wanted to make, but Linda's words made him question everything. Had he really been leading, or had he been too focused on his own agenda? She continued, her voice softer now. You thought you could take control because you wanted to prove yourself, but leadership isn't about force. It's about understanding the foundation. You've skipped over that. Evan's mind raced. He had assumed that power was something to be grabbed, something to be claimed. But now, standing before Linda, he realized that true leadership came from a deeper place, one he had overlooked. I didn't see it, he said quietly, the frustration beginning to drain from him. I thought I could change everything, but I never understood what was really needed. Linda's gaze softened. You're learning, and that's the first step. The silence between them lingered, heavy, but not uncomfortable. Evan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was no longer rushing toward it. Evan sat at his desk, staring at the stack of legal documents before him. His hand hovered over the signature line, his mind a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. The legal challenge had been filed. He had fought hard to break Robert's grip on the company, to prove that he, not his father, deserved control. But now, with the courts ruling in Robert's favor, Evan's world had come crashing down. He had lost. The leverage he thought he had was gone. His lawyer's voice echoed in his mind, the words cold and final. The court has upheld the governance structure. The founders' rights stand. Evan slammed his fist on the table, frustration boiling over. How could it have turned out like this? He had done everything by the book, fought with every ounce of energy he had. But Robert's legal framework, his unshakable hold on the company's foundation, had proven stronger than Evan's ambitions. The door creaked open, and Robert stepped into the room. His presence was calm, measured, as always. He didn't look at Evan with contempt or anger, just quiet understanding. Evan's chest tightened. Robert was here to finish what he had started. Evan, Robert said simply, his voice calm but carrying the weight of years of experience. The court has ruled. Your challenge is over. The company's governance will remain as it was designed. Evan's heart pounded. He was defeated, but he couldn't bring himself to say the words. The sting of failure was raw, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Robert didn't rush. He simply placed a document on the desk in front of Evan. I've signed the succession terms, he said, his tone steady. The board is aligned. This isn't punishment. It's correction. The company will move forward with oversight that ensures stability. Evan's gaze flickered to the document, the finality of it sinking in. Robert wasn't reclaiming the CEO title. He wasn't taking revenge. He was asserting his control in a way that Evan had failed to understand. Leadership wasn't about taking power. It was about shaping it, maintaining it, and ensuring it lasted. Robert's voice softened. Sign it, Evan. Accept what's been set in motion. This is what real control looks like. Evan stared at the signature line. The battle was over, and he was out of moves. With a sigh, his hand finally moved toward the pen. The lesson was clear. Authority was not something to be seized. It was something that had to be earned. and Robert had redefined what that meant. Evan signed, and with that, his fight ended. The company was finding its rhythm again. The chaos that had plagued its leadership was beginning to fade, and the operations were slowly returning to normal. The executives, who had once been divided, now moved in unison, guided by Robert's steady hand. The market had reacted swiftly to the shift in leadership, and investor confidence was climbing once more. Stocks steadied, and whispers of concern were replaced by murmurs of relief. Robert's next move, however, was unexpected. He stepped back, but this time it wasn't a retreat. It wasn't surrender. He had reasserted his authority, restored stability, and now he would leave the daily operations to others. But there was a twist. Robert wasn't stepping aside entirely. An oversight committee was formed, one that he personally handpicked. The committee would monitor the company's direction, but Robert would remain a constant presence in the background, watching carefully, guiding when necessary, but never directly interfering. The company was on track now, moving forward with clarity, but Robert's influence was quietly woven into the fabric of every decision. The executives knew his hand was still guiding them, even if they couldn't see it. The stability he had brought was undeniable. Evan remained within the company, but in a vastly different role. The advisory position, once something he dreaded, had become a quiet reflection of his diminished power. He wasn't fired, but he was watched. The board, especially Robert, kept a careful eye on his every move. Evan wasn't punished. He was simply reminded that leadership was not a title, but a trust earned through understanding, respect, and wisdom. Robert, meanwhile, absorbed the inevitable criticism calmly, as he always did. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He had stabilized the company and restored balance without ever losing his composure. The leadership that once felt so fragile was now firmly in place. But for Evan, the question remained. Could he ever rise again? The company had moved forward, but in the process, the balance had shifted, and Evan, left in the quiet shadow of Robert's influence, wasn't sure if he could ever reclaim what he thought was his. The silence between father and son grew, thick with unspoken truth. The door to Robert's office closed softly behind Evan, the sound echoing in the empty corridor. It was an unusual silence, one that carried the weight of unspoken things. Robert was already seated at his desk, the familiar, almost serene presence that had defined his leadership for decades. The room, with its minimalist decor and dark wood accents, felt colder now, the air heavier than usual. Evan stood in front of Robert, not quite sure what to say. His anger had dissipated over the last few days, replaced by something else. Frustration, yes, but also a creeping understanding. His father had never raised his voice. There had been no dramatic confrontations, no public shaming. Instead, Robert had quietly, methodically reasserted control. And Evan? He had watched, powerless, as the pieces fell into place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was a silence Evan wasn't used to. He had spent so many years fighting for his place at the table, challenging Robert's decisions, believing that his vision was the only path forward. But now, in this moment, everything felt different. The ground beneath him had shifted, and though he hadn't expected it, he felt the pull of something like respect. He wasn't sure if it was for his father's methods or for the quiet strength he had always exuded, but it was there. Finally Robert spoke, his voice calm, as it always was. "You've been pushing for change, Evan. I can see that. But there's more to leading this company than ambition. Evan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Robert's words in his chest. "I didn't want to lose control," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "I thought I was doing what was best, but I see now it wasn't just about making moves. I didn't understand the whole picture." Robert nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Leadership isn't about control, it's about guidance. You've been rushing, trying to prove something, but the company's foundation wasn't built for speed. It was built for endurance. That's why it's lasted. It takes time." Evan wasn't sure what to say. His pride still felt raw, but Robert's words, though firm, weren't as sharp as he expected. There was no scolding, no anger, just an acceptance of the reality they both knew. "I should have listened," Evan admitted, the words coming harder than he anticipated. The realization sat uncomfortably in his chest, but it was true. He had been too eager, too certain of his own path. Robert didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't heavy with conflict. It was the kind of quiet that follows a difficult conversation, the kind that acknowledges something deeper, something unspoken. "I've learned something too," Robert said finally, breaking the silence. "That sometimes stepping back doesn't mean losing control. It means knowing when to let others take the lead and when to guide from the shadows." Evan processed his father's words. The quiet humility in them struck him. It wasn't just about the company. It was about life. Robert had spent years building this company, not by grabbing power, but by guiding it, shaping it slowly, consistently. Evan had been in such a rush to get to the top, he hadn't noticed that leadership was never about the title. It was about understanding, patience, and timing. Evan met Robert's gaze. The weight of the years between them suddenly felt heavier. "I've been too impatient," he said. "I thought being the CEO was all that mattered, but it's not really." Robert nodded again, his gaze softening. "It never was. Leadership is not about titles, Evan. It's about how you guide others, how you make decisions, and how you handle the challenges along the way." For the first time, Evan felt like the conflict between them was finally dissolving. There were no apologies, no dramatic confrontations. It wasn't the reconciliation he had imagined, but it felt like something deeper was happening. His father wasn't offering forgiveness. He was simply offering understanding. Evan took a deep breath, the burden on his chest easing slightly. "I can't change what's happened," he said, his voice steady. "But I want to learn. I want to do it right. I want to prove that I can lead." Slowly but surely, Robert leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Then show me, not with words, but with actions. The company will always be here, and it will be waiting for you to find your place." Evan nodded, the path ahead still unclear, but for the first time, it didn't seem so insurmountable. The silence in the room wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was filled with something new, mutual understanding. The boundaries were set, and while the road ahead would be long, Evan knew the lesson had been learned. He would lead, but now with the patience and wisdom he had been lacking before. As Evan turned to leave the room, Robert's voice followed him. "Evan," he said softly, "you're still my son, and you'll always have a place here." Evan paused at the door, the words sinking in. It wasn't a victory, but it was the beginning of something different. And for the first time, Evan felt like he had the space to grow. The weight of the company's future pressed on Robert's shoulders as he sat at his desk. The succession plan laid out before him. It wasn't a decision he made lightly, but it was necessary. Evan's challenge had disrupted the company's flow, shaken its foundations. But Robert had always known that this moment would come. He had built this company not for himself, but for those who would continue the legacy. And now, more than ever, it was time to ensure that the company was no longer seen through the lens of one person's ambition. He picked up the pen, his hand steady as he signed the updated succession plan. It was a quiet act, one that no one would see, but one that carried immeasurable weight. It wasn't just a title shift, it was a cultural shift. The plan wasn't about removing power from Evan, but about ensuring that power was never again linked to a single individual's ego. The future of the company would not rest on one person's vision, no matter how brilliant or flawed. It would rest on the collective strength of those who truly understood what the company needed. The succession plan was more than just a formal document. It was a declaration of a new direction. Leadership training was now mandated for the entire executive team. Robert's approach had always been measured, slow, calculated. And while Evan had been too eager to push forward, too driven by the need to prove himself, Robert knew that the future would require more than just ambition. It required humility, vision, and the willingness to learn. The training wasn't optional. It wasn't about molding everyone into clones of Robert, but about instilling a culture that was less about individual glory and more about shared responsibility. Leadership wasn't about ego. It was about service. It was about building something that lasted, not something that could crumble at the whims of one person. Robert leaned back in his chair, looking over the city below. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets. It reminded him of the long road ahead. The company had weathered the storm, but stability wasn't something that could be maintained through force. It had to be ingrained from the ground up. The culture of the company, which had once been driven by the personal ambitions of its leaders, would now be anchored in collaboration. The board had already signed off on the new oversight committees, a system that would ensure no one person could ever disrupt the company again. Robert had seen how fragile the company could be when power became too centralized, when decisions were driven by one individual's personal agenda. As Robert signed the final document, he knew that his job wasn't just to lead, it was to safeguard the future. The systems were reinforced, the structure in place. The company would continue, and its future would not be defined by one person's legacy, but by the shared commitment of those who truly understood what leadership meant. Meanwhile, Evan was still part of the company. He hadn't been removed, but he had been given a different place, a place that wasn't at the head of the table. He was watching quietly from the sidelines. Robert knew that Evan's resentment would simmer for a while. His ego, his need for recognition, still burned brightly. But that fire would be tempered, slowly, inevitably. The role Robert had carved out for Evan was one of quiet observation, not interference. The company was moving forward, but Evan was not leading it. Robert's plan wasn't about revenge, it was about correction. He had never wanted to strip Evan of everything. He just needed to remove the disruption, to put the focus back on the company, not on one person's need to be seen as the one in charge. It was a lesson that Evan would eventually have to learn. His place, his future, would be determined not by titles, but by his ability to embrace the culture Robert had put in place. And as Robert looked over the final paperwork, the weight of it all didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a necessary step. The company's future was secure, not because of a single person's will, but because of the systems and culture they had built together. Evan's challenge had been a brief interruption. The future was no longer in question. The foundation had been laid, but even as Robert stood, leaving the paperwork behind. Something lingered in the air. The battle was over, but the war between father and son was far from finished. Evan would accept reality in time, but for now, he still harbored the desire to reclaim what he had lost. As Robert walked out of his office, the silence that followed him felt heavy, like the calm before another storm. The company was stable for now, but Evan's fire still burned. Weeks had passed since the boardroom reckoning, and Evan still felt the sting of the decision that had upended his life. The anger, though still present, had dimmed, replaced with something deeper, an unspoken grief. It wasn't just about losing control of the company. It was about losing his place, his identity. He had been so certain that he was destined to lead, that he could turn the company into something new. But now the reality had set in. Evan returned to the office. The same corridors he had once walked with authority, now unfamiliar, almost cold. The elevator ride up to the executive floor felt longer than it ever had before. As the door slid open, the quiet hum of the office surrounded him. It wasn't a place of chaos anymore. It was calm, methodical, and it was clear. He was no longer at the center of it. His new badge was waiting for him at security, a small token of his new place. As he swiped it through the reader, the familiar light turned green. The door clicked open, but it wasn't the full access he once had. It was restricted, a limited entry. Evan's chest tightened, his mind racing as he processed the symbolic meaning behind the new badge. He had been demoted, not in title, but in substance. The new badge wasn't just a practical tool, it was a reminder. He was no longer the one who walked freely between floors, making decisions, calling the shots. Now he had access, but only in certain spaces, only when permitted. He wasn't in control anymore. Evan's hand lingered on the badge for a moment, his fingers tracing the edges, the weight of it pressing down on him in a way he hadn't expected. The anger that had been his constant companion felt hollow now, replaced by a sobering clarity. This was Robert's way of showing him, of reminding him that leadership wasn't about entitlement. It was about understanding where power truly lies. The badge was a subtle but firm boundary, one that Evan had to respect, whether he wanted to or not. As he walked through the halls, past his former colleagues, he noticed the subtle change in their demeanor. There were no more nods of approval, no eager glances. Now, the respect he had once commanded seemed muted. People greeted him, but with a kind of reserved politeness, the way you would greet someone who had been put in their place. His presence no longer had the same weight. Respect returned slowly, if at all, but it wasn't the respect he had expected. It was a quieter, more tempered kind of acknowledgement. He finally reached his office, the same space, but now it felt different. The walls that had once felt like his domain now seemed distant, impersonal. He sat behind the desk, staring at the papers scattered before him. The role had changed. His responsibilities were still there, but they were now constrained by the boundaries Robert had set. Robert, meanwhile, had watched Evan's every move from a distance. Though he wasn't physically present in the office anymore, his influence remained. There was no confrontation, no dramatic gestures, just a quiet observance. Robert had redefined the power dynamic without raising his voice. It wasn't about punishment. It was about correction, about teaching Evan the value of restraint, of recognizing when to step forward and when to step back. Evan sat still, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His mind replayed the events leading to this moment, the arrogance, the mistakes, the things he had ignored. And now, with his limited access and the weight of Robert's quiet influence on his shoulders, Evan realized something. Control was never about the title, never about the title alone. It was about understanding, humility, and knowing when to let others lead. The office around him was silent. The buzz of activity outside his door felt distant, like the world was moving on without him. There was no anger in the air, no storm to weather, just quiet. The lesson Robert had been teaching him, slowly, subtly, had been internalized. The fight wasn't over, but Evan knew now that it wasn't a fight that could be won with force. It was a fight for understanding, for knowing the limits of his own ambitions. The badge that didn't work was more than a piece of plastic. It was a reminder of where he stood, of what he still had to learn. And Robert's silent guidance, from afar, was the constant undercurrent that would shape his future. Evan didn't move for a long while, the quiet of the office wrapping around him. The door clicked softly, and he looked up, half expecting Robert to be standing there, watching him. But Robert's absence was the point. The battle had been fought, and Evan knew, as the silence stretched on, that the lesson had been learned, and it was Robert who had won. Robert walked through the headquarters with the same quiet purpose he always had. His presence felt more than seen. The sleek hallways were filled with the hum of activity, the steady pace of a company that had found its balance again. There was no more chaos, no more sharp tension in the air. The weight of Evan's challenge, his rash ambition, had receded into the past. The company was moving forward, operating as it should, and Robert's control, though invisible, was more present than ever. He passed by his senior executives, who nodded in acknowledgement, their faces neutral but respectful. The system, the culture that Robert had built over decades, functioned smoothly. The decisions made at the top now flowed down like water, without interruption, without friction. There were no more power struggles. No one questioned the foundation. The work was being done, and it was being done well. The company had adapted. It was stable. No one dared challenge it anymore. Robert's steps were measured as he walked past the various departments. His office, once a place where he spent long hours shaping strategy and managing the company's direction, now felt distant, almost irrelevant. His influence was still felt everywhere, but it no longer needed to be asserted. It had been internalized, accepted, and respected. As he moved through the building, Robert's thoughts lingered on the changes he had made. The boardroom had shifted, yes, but so had the people. The executives who had once been unsure, who had questioned his decisions, now seemed to move with a shared understanding. They knew their place. They knew the rules. And Robert's quiet, consistent leadership had made the company better for it. Age was no longer mistaken for weakness. Robert had feared that the years would be a disadvantage, that his vision might become stale, or that his influence would wane as new blood emerged. But the truth was different. His experience had become an asset. His calm, unshakable presence was a reminder of the strength that only time and wisdom could bring. No one questioned his ability to lead. Not anymore. As the day drew to a close, Robert gathered his things and prepared to leave. He was an early riser, and he had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful moments were the quiet ones. The company was running smoothly. There was no drama, no fanfare. His influence didn't need to be broadcasted. It was there, woven into the very fabric of the organization. And now, as he walked out of the office, the building felt like it was running without him, as if it had become second nature to everyone involved. The quiet of the late afternoon enveloped him as he stepped out of the elevator and into the lobby. He looked around at the familiar faces, at the building that had become both his legacy and his refuge. The company had become more than just a business. It had become a well-oiled machine, functioning without noise, without the turbulence that had once threatened to unravel it. As he stepped into the car that was waiting for him outside, Robert paused, watching the building from a distance. He hadn't announced his power, hadn't declared his victory. It wasn't necessary. It never had been. Power doesn't announce itself, Robert thought quietly. It locks the door. And for the first time, Robert left the office without a sense of urgency. The company was secure, the future certain. As the car pulled away, the headquarters behind him stood still, steady, and the world continued, quiet and unyielding.